America wouldn't have a problem if we all could just blend in.
Amen.
But let me ask you this. What are the requirements for blending in?
That's a good question. I have no idea what the requirements for blending in are, but as much as I'd like to think of myself as a disruptor within my own profession, I don't like to necessarily think of myself too much as a disruptor within my own community. Although I do feel a need and an obligation to stand up for what's right and take a position. So what does it mean to blend in is a really good question. And it's not something I consciously think about. It's just something that has been a part of my persona.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Hello, my friend. It's been a while. Good to hear and see you again.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. It has been a while. These recordings aren't time-stamped, so it's kind of hard to tell how long it's been since our last recording. And since they aren't in any sequence, our listeners wouldn't know it. But frankly, a lot has happened in our lives and in the world.
Absolutely. You look younger, though. I mean, I think you got rid of that goatee. Did you decide to go back in time?
No, I just decided to get rid of hair off my face. That's all.
Well, thank you again to Nationwide for allowing Dr. Nelson to get the hair off of his face and for us to continue to have these courageous conversations. So, what's on your mind?
The resurgence of interest that the Ken Burns film has generated on the Holocaust, because it gives us an opportunity to re-examine just how Germany went wrong. But more importantly, it gives us an opportunity to view how the conversation in the US and the opinions of the American public wasn't that far from the opinions of the German Republic, and how not understanding the impact of allowing venal aspirations to suddenly take root and become the primary motivations for public policy, how those trends can suddenly lead to the Holocaust, let alone World War. And when you combine that with what's going on with Ukraine, I think that is probably the most important issue for us to begin discussing. But I think it has to start with our basic views of race. And that begins with discussing the basic views of the superior race. And frankly, every view of race begins with my race must be superior. Even our views of immigration tends to be based on our views of a certain group being superior to another group. That group could actually be a group within the same race. Black or Hispanic immigrants that are already in America may be against immigration for racial reasons. They may blame it on economics. They may blame it on other reasons, which the mythological concept of race allows you to do, but it is directly related to a feeling of superiority rather than empathy for those people who may honestly only trying to better the lives of their family and their relatives. So that leads me to a more personal question that we can build on. And that is, with this resurgence of interest on the Holocaust, and with the promotion of the idea that the political development that Hitler led in Germany were actually a pattern of political behavior that he adopted from America to begin with. You know, we keep talking as if Germany is so bad, and yet he used the playbook that Southern states used to keep African Americans under control after slavery. Now, we like to separate the Southern states as when it comes to race relations, they are a separate territory from the rest of America. But this was essentially America's doctrine that was allowed to be practiced in the extreme in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and Florida, and Louisiana, and Texas. However, there were shades of blue laws and Jim Crow laws throughout the entire nation in just about every state that restricted access and placed restrictions and obstacles on achieving the American dream for certain populations. But we've talked a lot about the African-American experience in our conversations. We haven't said a lot about the Jewish experience in this conversation. I find it fascinating is not the word, but that's the word I want to use, that religion seems to be as much a motivator for hate as race. And I am always amazed at the extent of venom against such a small, relatively small population of people that we call Jews, compared to all of the other demographics of this global sphere, that we focus so much on so few people, and we create so much of a myth about their influence on our society. And I'm talking to a Jew, and it would be wrong if we did not give you a chance to at least share your experiences, even if it's atypical. And so I'm truly interested in how you're viewing this recent shift in perspective of the Jewish experience in order to try to educate us as a society as to how we could go wrong again. But before we get to that, I think we have to look at personal impacts. And so that's where I'd like to start. You're not necessarily a practicing Jew, are you?
So let's start with some background. You laid out a whole plan for discussion. Hopefully I can remember some of it. If not, you'll ask me. But I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. New York may have more members of the Jewish faith than any city, or maybe even than Israel itself. And my dad was raised in what's called an Orthodox family, which is a very highly religious family. Growing up, they didn't use electricity from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. They spent Saturdays in temple. He went actually to what's called a yeshiva high school, which is a Jewish high school. So he was raised in an Orthodox or highly religious part of the Jewish religion. My uncle and his children maintained that. On the other hand, my father moved away from it to some of the more relaxed or liberal beliefs in the Jewish family. And my mom was Jewish, but with very little Jewish upbringing. So when I grew up, I had exposure to both extremes of Jewish life when we went to see my aunts and cousins and uncles, and it was very religious. When I was at home, it was less religious. And so I grew up and I went to temple, I went to synagogue, I went through the bar mitzvah process, but we didn't keep kosher, which kosher is got to do with the meals and the food that you eat. I didn't regularly go to temple. I didn't honor the Sabbath from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. But I was fully aware of the Jewish faith to the point that when I was in elementary school and high school, and I finally figured these things out, the community that I grew up in was a very Jewish dominant community, in the sense that we were actually let out from school. There was no school scheduled on the Jewish high holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So just like the rest of the world celebrates Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, we had the Jewish holidays not scheduled because the schools knew that the Jewish students would not be in class because they would be in temple. So I grew up with a Jewish background, understanding Judaism, learning about Judaism, etc. and understanding what the Holocaust was. I did not have any direct family members impacted by it. My grandfather on my father's side immigrated from Russia in the early 1900s, and the great-grandparents on my mother's side, even earlier than that, came from Russia. They probably had emigrated from Eastern Europe to Russia because there was a tendency to do that as well. There was a very large Russian population, a Jewish population in Russia. So none of my immediate family off the top of my head were directly impacted by the Holocaust because they had all moved to the United States by then. But let's suffice it to say, it was a very common discussion point. My mom spoke Yiddish, which is kind of a combination of Hebrew and Jewish, and I think a little Austrian in there, especially when she didn't want me to understand what she was saying. So I had the Jewish upbringing and the understanding, but I also had a very broad-based understanding of the rest of the world as well, since we lived in a liberal, open-minded community. We shared and understood the needs and concerns of people of different backgrounds and different colors. The 70s and 80s, we had some anti-Semitism going on, but I wasn't aware of it. I heard about it, but I was not directly impacted by it.
Why not?
Why not? Maybe because our community was, for whatever reason, not as overt a target back in that time frame as there were other issues, the Vietnam War being one of them. So there were other issues that might have been more directed and focused from that standpoint.
But you said you heard about it. What did you hear? And by the way, what period are we talking about?
In the 60s into mid 70s, when I went off to college.
Okay. So what did you hear about during that period?
What I heard about were, interesting breaking into Jewish buildings, painting swastikas on things.
In America?
In America, yes.
In New York?
In New York, in the South, and in other places within the country. But it was not, there's more knowledge about it now than I can remember growing up in that time frame. And probably because back in that time frame, you may remember this, there was a lot of civil rights activities going on that were more headline news than anti-Semitism.
Or at least publicly.
Correct. Maybe it got more headlines. Maybe the anti-Semitism was buried behind the other activities that were going on in the South.
Because I had to say that the Jewish community was very active in the civil rights movement as well.
Absolutely. I think the Jewish community felt a kinship to the Black community because the way we were treated in Germany and in other parts of the world, and the way you were being treated in the United States.
So I find it interesting that you said the way you were treated in Germany and other parts of the world, and not the way you were treated in America. And yet history suggests that your treatment in America was not all that accepting either. It sounds as if your sense of being was that you were accepted by this society, and most of the overt actions of discrimination occurred elsewhere, in particular in Germany. Now, I'm trying to reflect what you were thinking as a teenager, as a young man about to go to college. Clearly, your experiences supported that, but your awareness suggests that you didn't think America was that bad, whereas the recent series by Ken Burns suggests just the opposite.
And I would agree with that. I think growing up in a predominantly Jewish community, you have people like you around you, and there's a certain comfort in having people like you around you. I can't remember off the top of my head anything directly impacting any of the religious centers in our community that were Jewish in nature. I think we had a relatively peaceful upbringing. I mean, I'd love to be able to call my dad and ask him, but that's a little too late. But I really can't remember anything that was, and maybe somebody who listens to this that's a friend of mine will help remind me, but I can't remember in the areas on Long Island that we lived. I think I went to college in a very underdeveloped state regarding anti-Semitism and events against the Jewish religion, but much more knowledgeable about events against people of color that were living in similar communities and throughout the United States. Maybe I was very naive. I think that's a good term. I was naive about what my own people were going through because I was more aware of what your people were going through.
Well, I don't mean to be critical, but you're pretty naive about that too.
Yeah, well,
one of the things I wanted to bring up was that I also lived in a community of my kind, but I did know of all the things that was affecting my kind. And I was aware, as a matter of fact, I knew people that were seriously affected. The fear of making it worse was constant in my community. Parents tended to tamp down the proclivity of youth to speak out because in Mississippi, there was a citizens council that would monitor that kind of activity, and they could lose their jobs. They could lose their ability to provide for their children. So I'm trying to contrast here the differences. You obviously had a safe community, and clearly there were no temple incursions in your community that happened somewhere else, maybe as far away as Germany, although we do know it happened closer than that, but you weren't aware of it. Whereas in my community, anything that made the news was likely to have occurred in my community. And even if it occurred in a state, one state over in Alabama, I would know about it before the news, partly because we had relatives in all these states. But anyway, that's one striking difference that I'm noticing here.
So where I grew up in the New York metro area, with the large population of Jewish individuals, both in New York City and in the suburbs around New York City.
As you said, more than in Israel.
Yeah, so we may not have been as much of a minority from a percentage standpoint.
There was a Jewish nation within the state of New York.
Within the New York metro area. Now, once you got outside of New York, the 5 boroughs of New York and Long Island, completely different world. Once you get to upstate New York, completely different world. It's a much more rural type setting, and as you know, from a political standpoint, you tend to be a little bit more democratic in the urban centers and a little bit more Republican in the more rural centers. So I would suggest that the suburbs and the New York metro area were highly represented by members of the Jewish population.
Did you travel throughout the rest of the state of New York?
Not really. I mean, when we were, great question. When we would vacation, we would go to Miami or Fort Lauderdale or on a cruise.
To other Jewish communities?
To other communities that had a relatively high Jewish population. Miami was full of snowbirds, people who moved from New York and lived in New York. My dad had clients that were in central Pennsylvania and North Carolina that were probably completely different demographically. I don't think he dealt with anything from an anti-Semitic standpoint, trying to think back. But, you know, we would go to Pennsylvania, we would go to New England.
What parts of Pennsylvania?
Philadelphia, but we took a trip out to the Amish country, and much different world. I mean, no utilities, no hot and cold running water, outside bathrooms, etc.
And I assume these trips that you took, were they by car or plane?
Car.
So as you traveled through these rural communities, did you notice anything different? Did you feel as welcomed? Did you stop for gas? Did you? Yeah. Was it just another part of your society?
I didn't feel we stood out in a community
You didn't.
No, did not.
I know.
And
I'm saying you didn't stand out.
no, we didn't stand out because unless somebody wanted to make an assumption, the color of our skin very much matched the color of the skin of the communities in which we were visiting.
What kind of car did you have?
Buick,
Mm-hmm.
you know, probably an Oldsmobile. My dad didn't get a Cadillac until probably the mid to late 70s. And one of the other differences, maybe for many, yes, ladies and gentlemen, I grew up privileged. I spent my summers up in a summer camp in Maine for 8 to 10 weeks. And so again, the summer camp was predominantly, and I've got to say, probably 98% white and a relatively high Jewish population. But I don't think that, again, it kind of sheltered me from maybe some of the realities that were out there, because here you are out in the country having fun, playing ball, swimming, etc. So there's a certain amount of sheltering that you get.
And I assume you were accepted pretty well by your peers in the camp.
Yeah.
And treated. And was this a Boy Scout camp or
No, it was in the Northeast, most kids in the summer from the New York metro area would go to a summer camp somewhere. And
not most kids.
yeah, well, a high percentage.
Okay.
Kids that were from communities that could afford to go there. But those communities were that I was much aware of, because there were a lot of kids from a lot of other communities there, but it wasn't a Boy Scout camp. It was a camp that included camping and sports and all sorts of other things. It's pretty much a social camp. We had dances with girls' camps that were nearby. But again, it was predominantly white. And it did not have any religious component to it.
Or other mission-oriented component.
No, it was get the kids out of the house for the summer, because I don't know what else we're going to do with them.
Yeah.
And very much on the East Coast. When we moved to California, and I think even when I was in Illinois, summer camps weren't as big a thing. In California, it's almost unheard of. So till I went off to college, and even to a degree, even at Cornell, I lived in a bubble, a protected bubble. And even many of my friends at college were Jewish as well. Different communities, grew up slightly differently, maybe on the economic scale, maybe from a diversity scale. But even in college, there was a tendency to hang out with people that you had a commonality with. Now, when I joined a fraternity, the fraternity was much more diverse, and it was very cool to learn about other people's backgrounds. And when you go to university, obviously you've got people from all over the state, the country, et cetera, even all over the world, although I can't remember all that many at that point in time. And if you're going to ask the question, how diverse was the fraternity? From a color standpoint, very little. From a religious standpoint, much higher. I still lived in a bubble.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that before college, you did not personally witness or suffer from religious or ethnic hatred?
It would be fair to say that, to the best of my recollection.
Did that change after college or during college? And if so, and if it did, what was the first incident you can remember that someone that you felt you were treated differently?
I don't recall any experiences at Cornell of that nature while I was in school there. I spent a year studying abroad in Ireland, okay, which obviously is not a very highly Jewish population. Ironically, the mayor of Dublin at that point in time was Jewish. And I felt fully accepted by all of the Irish people, all the Catholics. I probably went to church more often than I went to temple in the time that I was in Ireland, because it was very cool to go into some of these old churches. I don't think I had ever been in a church until I went to Belfast and was up there with a group of friends. So it was very cool to learn about other people. I felt no ill will about my religious beliefs. Now, I don't wear my religion on my sleeve, for lack of a better metaphor. As you are aware, many of the extremely religious Jews wear what's called a kippah or a skull cap, which is part of the more highly religious components of Judaism. So there is nothing that called me out as being any different than anybody else.
I'm going to take you to task a little bit on this last statement you made. I find it interesting wearing religion on your sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to wear religion on your sleeve if you're not practicing the religion.
Right.
Right? Do you consider yourself a man of faith?
Define what you mean by a man of faith.
I don't define that. I allow individuals to define that for themselves.
I believe in the Jewish faith the way I want to believe in it. So I'm dancing around your answer because I don't have a definition for it.
For me, being a man of faith means I believe there is a spiritual being. There is a higher deity.
Absolutely believe in that. I believe in the writings of the Old Testament and the teachings of the Old Testament and the Talmud and of those. So yes, I am a man who believes in the teachings of Judaism.
Okay, and therein lies our difference.
Right.
This just got real.
Okay.
Our difference. We've never addressed this before in terms of our difference in our basic beliefs.
Right.
And I'm not sure we're the two people that should even try it because neither one of us wear our religions on our sleeves. Although we try to incorporate our principles, the principles of our religions in our lives.
And by the way, that was really a bad statement to wear your religion on your sleeve, because if you have any understanding of the Holocaust, the Jews and the ghettos in Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe, the Jews were made to wear a Star of David on their sleeve to indicate that they were Jewish.
I'm glad you pointed that out. Yes.
That was a really bad statement for me to make.
Well, it just goes to show how these mantras are developed through history. Back to our original discussion. So yes, you grew up in a protective bubble. Yes, you never had any real personal disfiguring or disconcerting experience related to your being a Jew. You recognize that being a non-practicing Jew makes it easier for you to melt into the fabric of America. And you were definitely less threatening to anybody who might have hard factional feelings about Jewish belief and the Jewish race. I must tell you, our previous conversation that says you don't believe in the New Testament, and I do, does help focus on the differences that we have in religion, but this isn't a really religious discussion here. And just as I don't want to get into whether or not you're truly baptized if you are fully submerged or sprinkled with holy water, we'll save that discussion for another day by more learned people in that area than you or I. But now we've arrived where you are a young man. Well, you're now on the journey of becoming accomplished, and you are a personable man. I can see why you would be accepted in almost any group or community. This is your last chance to tell me if you've ever run into any personal obstacles as a result of being Jewish.
To the best of my knowledge, no. To the best of my knowledge, I have not directly been impacted by anti-Semitism. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of memory that I can go on Jerry Springer and come out with. But to the best of my knowledge, I have not been discriminated against because of religion.
First of all, I'm happy for you. And though I find that somewhat refreshing in that everybody seems to find some reason why they were held back or what have you, I have to ask the question, why do you think you've had that type of experience? You already explained why you think it happened in your early life. What do you attribute your lucky or fortunate trek through life?
I will attribute my fortunate trek through life to doing everything I could to blend into the community in which I lived. So when I lived in Central Illinois for 6 years at the University of Illinois, yes, I was a student, but I was also a resident. I blended into the community. I didn't try to be one thing or another thing that I was or wasn't. I just tried to blend in and be a part of everybody and everything that was going on. And I did that in grad school. I did that throughout veterinary school. So obviously Central Illinois is a relatively low Jewish population. I shouldn't say obviously. Central Illinois has a relatively low Jewish population. I moved to Orange County, California, which had a Jewish population, but still a smaller percentage than was present in the New York metro area. And I think what I have done is just by being me, I just tried to blend into the community. I don't think, and I didn't try to do anything that identified me as anything more than Peter Weinstein, veterinarian, or Peter Weinstein, person.
So the name Weinstein did not raise any hackles, did not cause people to ask about your...
No, in fact, I'll tell you a story. This weekend, I was coming back. I think I was in Miami, and the driver asked if I was from Germany, because he was from Germany via Turkey. And he said, it's a common name. I said, well, my multi-generations were German, moved to Russia. So my name, Weinstein, relatively speaking, outside of Harvey, no relationship, by the way, is a relatively common Eastern European name.
Jewish or not?
Exactly.
Okay. I did not know that.
Right. And so commonly the question I get is it Weinstein or Weinstein? That's actually the most common question I get. And I said, well, on the East Coast and the West Coast, it's Weinstein. In the Midwest, it was Weinstein. And in Ireland, they called me Weston because it was just much easier for them. Whatever you're comfortable with, just call me. Now, I probably am pissing off some people who are listening to this because they would like to see me stand up more, maybe on a religious standpoint, but that's just the way I have worked my life.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because my next question was going to be, or my observation was that based on your life, America wouldn't have a problem if we all could just blend in.
Amen.
But let me ask you this. What are the requirements for blending in?
That's a good question. I have no idea what the requirements for blending in are, but as much as I'd like to think of myself as a disruptor within my own profession, I don't like to necessarily think of myself too much as a disruptor within my own community. Although I do feel a need and an obligation to stand up for what's right and take a position. So what does it mean to blend in is a really good question. And it's not something I consciously think about. It's just something that has been a part of my persona. Easy to communicate with, willing to listen, not being judgmental, agreeing to disagree, and not necessarily coming down on one side or the other, but really trying to be I many times I'm way too much Switzerland and not enough one side or the other.
There's an alter ego to that question.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, if I choose not to blend according to the expectations of the group that defines the blend, does that mean that I'm not part of America?
No, I think we need to have, people on either side of the bell-shaped curve, or whatever you want to call it, either side of any issue. But I think it's how you deal with those issues and not letting them become a war, but letting them become a courageous conversation that helps to shrink some of the gaps and the chasms that have been created by identifying people's differences instead of focusing on people's similarities.
I appreciate your trying to answer that question, because you are a blender. I'm not sure some of our listeners would recognize the veracity of that opinion coming from a person who is blending in so easily.
Right.
While you were talking, I was thinking, well, I have a problem blending in from the moment I walk in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
know?
It would be very difficult for me to be me and have your skin color.
Yeah. On the other hand, I have heard conversations where that's not the issue. The issue is, are you truly an American? And this gets back to the veracity of truth for me. And yet, when I quote the Constitution and the protected rights of the Constitution, I find that even the definition of patriots becomes questionable, because for some reason, my promotion of equal justice under the law does not ring as true as it does if a white, in quotes, compatriot uses the same, quoting the same phrase. And it doesn't apply when certain people suggest that the law doesn't even apply to them. And though I dismiss the egotism that caused that statement to be made, I cannot dismiss the people that accept. And suddenly, even the attempt to blend becomes fraught with unequal reactions.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Nationwide. And thank you to our listeners. I think I laid myself pretty bare today, and probably not completely, but enough to get people thinking. And so thank you for stripping me naked, Phil. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Peter, for cooperating and sharing. I too encourage our listeners to send us your thoughts, your responses, and maybe even future topics that you'd like for us to address.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll catch up next time.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.